All right, thank you. As David mentioned, I'm from the Financial Health Network. I'm going to be talking about respondent willingness to share credit report data in the context of the Understanding America study. The Financial Health Network runs an annual survey that's focused on household financial well-being through the UAS. As David mentioned, we're about to enter our 7th year of doing that. And we've recently asked respondents for their consent to link their credit reports from a credit bureau to their survey responses. And the goal of this project is to understand who's consenting and why or why not. My co-authors from FHN are Kenan Sipa and Wanjira Chege, and from USC Caesar, Marco Engrasani and Jeremy Burke. So why are we interested in this? Well, administrative data gives you highly detailed information about your respondent with minimal respondent burden. In the context of credit data, that means credit scores, detailed histories of delinquency, different types of debt ownership, things that are difficult to ask about in detail on a survey. And there are lots of researchers out there working with high quality samples of credit data, but those samples typically lack the kind of unique insights that you can get from surveys, of course. So high quality linked survey and credit data is still pretty rare and potentially very powerful. And we care about who's consenting and why, because as researchers, of course, we're concerned about non-consent bias in the sample, and survey administrators want to improve the processes they're using to invite people to consent to these kinds of projects to hopefully reduce that non-consent bias. So this is a quick summary of what that consent question looks like. So we guarantee to the respondent that the process will not affect their credit score in any way, which is something I'll return to later. We compensate them $10 just for consenting, and we also emphasize that no other action is required on their part beyond just providing permission to us. So we have a variety of variables in UAS data that we can look at to see if our respondents are consenting in a way that is at least consistent with some of the drivers of consent to share administrative data that have been established in the literature. I'll talk about those drivers a little bit more in detail as I go through the results, but to quickly preview what we'll be looking at: respondent income and financial stress, respondents' self-reported credit health, financial literacy, online banking, a couple of personality characteristics that we think may be associated with willingness to share sensitive data, and then a variety of measures of respondents' engagement in the panel generally. We also have a strong interest in racial and ethnic differences because of their implications for the representativeness of this data, but this is not something that has really been covered or established in the literature yet, to our knowledge. So from 2020 to 2022, 8,601 respondents were asked for their consent, and about 55% consented. We are going to be running multivariable logistic regression predicting the odds or the probability of consent. All the results I'm going to show are from really kind of like our final specification with all of our variables of interest in it, and I'll run through those variables. And our analytic sample is slightly smaller than 8,601 because of some missingness in some of those variables. Okay, so I'm going to go basically hypothesis by hypothesis and show for each of these independent variables the regression adjusted probabilities of consenting to share credit data conditional on all these other covariates. So starting with income and financial stress, we see that both lower income respondents and respondents reporting higher levels of financial stress are slightly more likely to consent, although this is not the largest association that we'll see in these results. And it's certainly possible that both of these groups are more motivated to consent by that $10 incentive. Another financial characteristic that we thought might play a different role in consent is the respondent's self-assessment of their own credit score. So we thought that people with really great credit scores, or people who thought their credit scores were really great, would be more willing to share that information with us. But what we actually see is this kind of U-shaped relationship. And we see that people with the worst credit are actually the most likely to consent to share this information with us. And keep in mind, this is after controlling for income and financial stress and all these other covariates. So certainly not consistent with social desirability bias as an explanation. And if I have time, I'll return to that in our discussion. We also see that financial literacy is pretty strongly associated with financial literacy is pretty strongly associated with consent, as is banking online. So people who say they accessed a bank account online in the past 12 months. And we might think that both of these groups may be better understanding what is being asked of them when they're being asked to consent to this, as they're more financially savvy or more familiar with online financial activity. Turning to personality, we do see statistically significant, but not particularly practically large associations with trusting and risk tolerance. So respondents who consider themselves to be more generally trusting people are a bit more likely to consent, although you can see the relationship is not super consistent there. And then respondents who consider themselves more risk tolerant are a bit more likely to consent as well. Turning to variables that describe how a respondent is engaged in the panel otherwise, we see that respondents who respond to a higher percentage of the surveys in the panel that they are invited to are more likely to consent. And the largest magnitude difference we see by far in all of these results is that respondents who had also consented to share their bank account transaction data with the UAS through the UAS Fin project were much, much more likely to consent to share their credit data as well. And the same is true, although to a slightly lesser extent, with those who consented to share their Fitbit data. So pretty strong associations with two other administrative data linkage or passive data collection projects in the UAS. And finally, we want to spend some time on racial and ethnic differences, even though, as I said, we don't have a clear hypothesis for this. As you can see, white respondents are more likely than Latinx respondents to consent, who are in turn more likely than Asian and Black respondents to consent to share their credit data. I don't think we have a great understanding of why those differences are persisting even after we control for all these other demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. One driver that is mentioned in the literature, driver of a respondent's willingness to consent to share administrative data, is that respondent's attitude or trust in the administrative agency itself, which in this case would be the credit bureau. We know that there's lower levels of trust in financial institutions for historical reasons in communities of color. So if the same holds for credit bureaus, then lack of trust in credit bureaus may be driving that difference, but we really don't have the variables to test that directly. Okay, so to quickly summarize, the respondents that are the most likely to consent, white respondents, lower income, higher levels of financial stress, people on either side of that U shape of self-rated credit score, people who are more financially literate and who bank online, slight associations with risk tolerance and trusting, and then finally, people who participate in UAS surveys and other administrative data collection projects more regularly are more likely to consent as well. Okay, so while we are unable to test a lot of the drivers that are in the literature, established in the literature, directly with the variables that we have, we think that our results are consistent with some of those drivers. Incentive motivation, possibly, comprehension of the consent request that's being made, the attitude towards the survey administrator, which in this case would be UAS or USC, although we want to note that it's difficult to pull that apart from the respondents' just general enthusiasm for contributing to survey research or to science generally. And then this has definitely raised some areas for further investigation. To tie it back to Alex's presentation, I don't think we really have variables we need to directly measure privacy preferences or data security concerns among these respondents. I don't think we know what's going on with credit score with that U-shape. One hunch we have could be that people with mediocre credit scores are concerned that the linkage will somehow harm their credit, even though we told them that it wouldn't. Whereas people with really poor credit, really damaged credit may think, what do I have to lose with this? And then, as I mentioned, I don't think we understand those racial and ethnic differences particularly well yet. So definitely an area for further investigation. Thanks for your time.